in order to keep growing at 50% per year, Tesla not only needs enough lithium, they need enough anode material, copper, nickel, all these other. So it could be that intermittently there's other materials, other issues, manpower, machines that gum up that 50% rate. So I would ask those people, well, how long do you expect Tesla to continue growing at 50% per year? Because if they continue growing at 50% per year for 20 years, they've exceeded the mass of the universe. So it has to end sometime. It has to end sometime. So it's I don't think it's a doomsday scenario where Tesla, later this decade hits about 10 to 15 million vehicles a year and a huge amount of energy storage, and then they start to level off. They'll be a huge company by then. Just 5 years away from now, they'll be huge.
Let me ask you a quick question here, and we've started pinging the chat for Q&A as well, so we can start bringing in some Q&A, some questions from the audience. One of the things you mentioned earlier was that the United States has some of the longest lead times for throwing up a mine, for lithium mine. How big of a deal would it be if the U.S., in conjunction with the IRA bill that they've put out there, and seems like the United States is really trying to localize a lot of the manufacturing and supply of that sort of the next generation of vehicles and energy storage by incentivizing people to opening up, battery manufacturing and stuff. How big of a deal would it be if the United States can lower the lead time from say 9 years to 2 years? Would that make a significant difference in your thesis?
Marginally. I've already mostly assumed that, and I've also assumed, as I said, that Tesla would kind of develop the mine and do the permitting in parallel. So that kind of, I
So it's
tried
baked
to.
in already.
Yeah, it's pretty much baked in already. Now, one exception is if there were, and I said this in the video, which I think is a low likelihood, if we kind of did like a wartime effort, if there was a war with China, which China owns most of the lithium supply chain, then things could change drastically. But that doesn't mean Tesla's overall lithium supply would be better because there would be conflict with China, and maybe they're kind of choking on Tesla's supply chain, and that's not the best option for sustainability as well. As a side note, God, I'm going to go on a big tangent here, but
Please do.
one of the most important things uh, for transitioning the world to sustainable energy isn't just having the technology; it's having the social stability globally in order to continue for all these countries to continue growing. And that's not something that people really appreciate. Too often we focus too much on the technology side of transitioning the world to sustainable energy. But it's only going to happen if there's a certain amount of a stability on a global level. And there's actually scenarios that the UN has mapped out. All right, well, if we have all the technology, but there's a huge amount of inequality in the world, and that's breeding strife, that could slow us down just as much as technology. So it's a side of the argument that I think needs a lot more lip service, that we need to make sure that we develop good relations internationally and have good policy. So
That's a great call out. And if there's one thing that I'm actually concerned about into this decade is the stability of relationships between countries because of how interconnected we are. But what's interesting is that there has been this movement to localize a lot of manufacturing and supply chain and raw materials, which is almost diminishing the risk of that happening. So as long as we have good relations and companies and firms continue to localize the supply chain, it seems like we might be okay. It's still going to be challenging as hell, and it's still going to be very hard to hit these very ambitious growth targets. But at least the path will be easier than the alternative.
I do think it's a very apt point, actually. I mean, Elon twice recommended this book, Destined for War, I think by Alison Graham recently, which really talks about how so many people think that the U.S. and China are just on an unavoidable path for hot war. And this book was phenomenal. I read it earlier this year, and it just goes through all these historical examples of when, there was an existing power and a rising power. There's, I think, 7 or 8 different examples they go through of times when they had hot war and times when they kind of managed to coexist peacefully. And it was very obvious that the right answer is to coexist peacefully. Both parties are always better off if you can find ways to, cooperate instead of just saying, hey, you're threatening my power and go to war. So I think it's a strange point to be making geopolitical points like that on a lithium conversation, but I think it's really is critical. I mean, it can drastically change everything that we're talking about.
And I would say it's when I look at the potential bear arguments for Tesla, I think these are the two things that are mostly underserviced. As part of it is a lithium supply, but even then, it's not that bad of a scenario. That's a strategic risk in the long term. But you're not talking about the company going out of business. You're just talking about growth moderating, which has to happen at some point. But the other aspect of it is geopolitical. These are these black swan things, and I think that's the only other major strategic threat that I can see to Tesla. And I've thought quite a bit about it. I don't know if you guys have any other things that you can throw in there.
I mean, I really think that's the biggest one. I think when it comes to the technology and capability and manufacturing know-how or processes or whatever you want to call it, I think one of Tesla's really long-term advantages is its capability of being very innovative and figuring out how to get stuff done. So I don't really view that as, yes, there'll be challenges and there'll probably be misses, but they will get there eventually. It's these external factors that are super disruptive that could take literally the bottom out of Tesla being able to work. As long as Tesla can work, Tesla will be able to achieve its things, and other companies will as well. But if you can't work, it's like all those variables are gone. So that's how I think about it, and I'm glad you brought it up because I agree with Matt. It's an underrated point, and it's so fundamental. And I think it really just highlights how big of a deal this transition is. Where people panic when there is a war related to oil. It's like everyone's gas prices go through the roof, and everybody's freaked out about being able to have access to energy. That's going to be batteries. That's what lithium is. That's what all these chemicals and raw materials are for the next generation of energy and industry. And this conversation is sort of like a foreshadowing of some of the near-term and medium-term challenges. But in the next 100 years, this is less than a fraction of a percent of the total, I don't know, whatever unit of measure you want to use, of what's going to be used to run the world and wherever else we are, So that the scope of this thing is nuts. It's just, we're just very, 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 very early.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild that, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's kind of wild that Elon has also thought about these existential risks. It's like, hey, we should start SpaceX because what if society ends? And it would be sure nice to have like a backup on Mars and elsewhere. So it really is bizarre how forward thinking he's been on all this stuff. And it was obvious he's ahead of the curve on AI also. And it's like, now that's the topic du jour. And he's like, yeah, I've been both planning for and warning about this like for a decade. And like people just thought I was crazy. It's so ridiculous how ahead of the curve he's been on all this.